students. He explained that Deng, although an advocate of economic reform, was not willing to make social or political reforms and wanted to use the military to crush the democracy movement. Deng was furious at Zhao for letting Gorbachev and the world know that Deng was the man in charge. Deng was even more furious with the students and the people of Beijing. Deng was the supreme leader of China. His meeting with Gorbachev, the supreme leader of the Soviet Union, was to be a grand diplomatic achievement. Instead, the students had embarrassed him and his government on international TV. Deng began to hunger for revenge. The students had made him look foolish, and Zhao made him look inept. Indeed, Deng could not control the people of China, and he could not even control the food in his own mouth. Across Beijing, over 1 million people from every imaginable occupation and age group were now cheering on the students and joining in the democracy movement. Workers, doctors, lawyers, and reporters from every newspaper, all demanding democracy, freedom of speech, and the end to corruption. Hundreds of thousands of people across China were now supporting the students, with protests and demonstrations breaking out at dozens of cities and universities. Everyone wanted to join in. They wanted to be part of history, and people brought their husbands, wives, children, and their parents, all chanting and singing and shouting slogans demanding freedom and democracy. Although the students were not calling for a revolution, revolution was taking place. Suddenly newspapers were reporting the truth, and the people were giving voice to long simmering complaints. Suddenly it seemed safe to voice opinions, to disagree with the dictators, to call for change and the end of oppression, and everybody wanted to join in. Fasting students were also starting to drop with alarming frequency, many driven away by ambulance to be treated at local hospitals. Organizers held up placards showing the number of students who had fallen. Over 342 students had collapsed. They were fainting at the rate of 1 every 6 minutes. After meeting with Gorbachev, Zhao Ziyang stood on the roof of the Great Hall of the People and stared with amazement at the hundreds of thousands of people massed below. What he also saw were banners demanding democracy, freedom of speech, the end of corruption, and asking, "Where is China's Gorbachev?" Knowing they had the support of millions of Chinese, the leaders of the democracy movement were now demanding meetings with Li Peng on live TV. There was a growing rift within the Communist Party, and a growing power struggle between the reformers led by Zhao Ziyang and the right-wing reactionaries led by Deng and Li Peng. Zhao and the reformers realized that all might be lost if the students did not agree to end the hunger strike and to call off the protests and demonstrations and return to class. Reformers were facing an impossible situation. If they couldn't get the students to leave Tiananmen Square and to end the demonstrations, the right-wingers would win. Zhao, hoping to convince the students to end their demonstrations, sent a message commending them for their patriotism and acknowledging their demands for greater democracy and promising that Deng's editorial would be rescinded. Zhao Ziyang also sent a representative who promised the students that the Central Committee of the Communist Party would view the demonstrations as patriotic and no one would be persecuted if they agreed to end the strike and the demonstrations. Instead, the students and their leaders, believing they had the support of millions of Chinese, increased their demands for dialogue. By May 18th, with a million people in the streets, Peng and the conservative right-wing leadership felt they had no choice but to meet with the student leaders. When Li met with the student leaders in the Great Hall of the People, in an event that was televised across China, he had only one goal in mind: convincing the students to stop their fasting and to leave the square. In response, the student leaders, feeling perhaps overconfident, informed Li that it was up to the student leaders to decide what questions should be discussed. Li and the other right-wing leaders were angered and felt insulted by the student leaders, who Li called rude and impolite. The student leaders responded with arrogant contempt, reminding Li that the students had the backing of 1 million people. Li was warned that his government could be overthrown and replaced if it failed to represent the Chinese people. The meeting solved nothing other than to harden the resolve of Li, Deng, and Yang to use military force.
而且我也差不多讲了我的观点。如果你们认为你们自己在座的这些同志不能够完全左右他们的行动嘛，那我就是通过你们。
On Friday morning, Zhao Ziyang made a last desperate attempt to save the democracy movement in his own position as General Secretary of the Communist Party. He made his way to Tiananmen Square, talking and shaking hands with students, and then boarded a bus containing hunger strikers. Zhao realized the end was near. His eyes were filled with tears. He took a megaphone and pleaded with the students to end the hunger strike and the demonstrations. He said, "We deserve your criticism. We are not here to ask for your forgiveness. We all want our country to become better." But it was impossible, he said, to solve every problem in an instant. You are young, and you should live to see the realization of your dreams for a new and modern China. The channels for dialogue are wide open. But he warned, if you insist on immediate change, on immediate answers, if the demonstrations do not end now, it will soon be too late, and all will be lost. According to transcripts, Yang, Peng, and other top leaders met with Deng that evening, where they discussed the threats to their power posed by the democracy movement and the specter of another cultural revolution which had removed many of them from power in the 1960s and 70s. According to transcripts, and I quote, "We have 1 million people in the streets. We can't let this descend into rampant lawlessness like the Cultural Revolution. Didn't we get enough of that the first time around? Do we really want it to happen again? The 1 million-person demonstrations are even bigger than the Red Guard rallies during the Cultural Revolution. Without martial law, we are saying we accept indefinite anarchy. These people are asking for it. The PLA must go in and carry them out on their backs. Give them no mercy." The specter of the Cultural Revolution, the specter of a people rising up against their corrupt leaders, frightened them all. Deng knew firsthand the dangers of the Cultural Revolution. He had been viciously attacked as a capitalist voter who was enriching himself and his family. He had been purged twice from positions of leadership, and his mentor, President Liu, had been imprisoned, tortured, and murdered.